Well, for almost a century, whatever its other flaws, the American Civil Liberties Union has positioned itself as a champion of free speech in the United States, and they have been. They stood up for all kinds of unsavory characters on principle. Klansmen, neo-Nazis, the Westboro Baptist Church. There's almost no ugly figure in the history of American free speech jurisprudence that the ACLU has not defended, and that may be changing, however, now. Last week, critical race studies expert Kay Sue Park, who's a professor of some kind, wrote a New York Times op-ed, barely literate one, saying the ACLU needs to, quote, rethink its position on free speech. The ACLU itself, meanwhile, has announced that it won't defend a group's right to march in public if that group plans to carry guns, even if those guns are legal. Allura Nanos is a lawyer. She's an editor also at lawnews.com, and she joins us now. Allura, thanks a lot for coming on tonight.
Thanks for having me.
So part of this seems to me to be disingenuous. I've written a lot about the ACLU and its history on speech, and going back literally almost 100 years, they have defended people nobody else would, because their position has always been, if free speech doesn't protect unpopular speech, it's not really free. It's a meaningless right unless it protects the minority. I don't see that anything's changed. We don't have more Nazis in America than we had 30 years ago, so why wouldn't you be standing with that century-long tradition of protecting free speech?
Well, Tucker, I think two things. First of all, the ACLU is a private organization. It has limited resources, and it's not going to take on, nor does it have to take on, every client in the world.
That's true.
It has made a decision that these extremist, white supremacist hate groups are just not worth its limited resources. So I think that there is a change there, but the change is not a change about the interpretation of First Amendment law. Okay, the ACLU has not said that it no longer believes hate speech is protected. The ACLU is looking at these groups and saying that they pose an increased risk of violence. And by the way, speech that is really violent or creates imminent danger isn't protected anyway. So these groups really often don't fall under the protected speech anyway.
Well, that's wrong. That's wrong, as you know. I mean, this was all decided in Brandenburg versus Ohio, 1969.
That's right. Brandenburg said speech that incites violence is not protected, and that's what's going on here. But it has to be. No, that's not true. It didn't say that. It's imminent violence. Imminent violence. Yes,
like
that's
right now.
Imminent violence.
So I can get up and say, under Brandenburg, I think we ought to overthrow the government by force. That is protected speech.
That's right.
If I say burn 7-Eleven right now, that is not.
That's exactly right.
That has been the distinction for my entire lifetime. What has changed is not the law, not the nature of the so-called hate groups. What's changed is the ACLU has caved to mob pressure.
Well, I actually think that's where you're wrong, because I do think that one of the things, you're right that the law has not changed. You're wrong that the hate groups have not changed, because in fact, the culture that we live in right now has changed significantly with respect to white supremacist hate groups. These groups are now more violent than ever. They're growing at a rate that's bigger than ever. And we now have a president that has done things that have emboldened these groups. So there actually is more of a threat of imminent violence than there ever has been before.
Well,
I think if you asked anyone in law enforcement, if you asked anyone in law enforcement, they would tell you that there is a greater risk of imminent violence now than ever before.
Okay, I don't know what you mean by anyone in law enforcement. That's an entirely subjective judgment, and I think it actually betrays a lack of historical perspective on your part. But leaving that aside, it doesn't change the principle. And the principle is this. Unless you are telling people to commit violence imminently, right now, you have a constitutionally protected right of free speech. Do you no longer agree that it's worth, on principle, standing up for that? The unpopular minority has a right to say things the majority hates under the Bill of Rights. You don't agree with that anymore. No one on the left does. Well, that's why I'm saying the whole system is going to collapse unless you guys stand up and do what you've done for 100 years, which is defend free speech.
I think that that's an unfair characterization. Just because the ACLU has chosen to not represent this one particular group, I don't think that you can take that forward and make the judgment that this group has decided that no one with an unpopular view is worth their time.
No, but it's not just the ACLU. I mean, no, you're making a fair point in that they don't need to take every case. I agree with that, of course. And under normal circumstances, I would say whatever. The ACLU is kind of irrelevant anyway. We have the Supreme Court decisions, okay? But it's not just them. It's all over the American left. You are seeing people say, speech equals violence. I'm not going to defend that.
But when
The left
speech does
defended
equal
a-
violence, when speech does equal violence, and I will agree that speech doesn't always equal violence. Even hate speech doesn't always equal violence.
There's no such thing as hate speech. What is hate speech? Why
There's
are you making
no
up?
such thing. Well, let me give you a great
Legally,
example.
there is no such thing as hate speech.
Okay. So let's just put that aside for a minute, because I think we're going to agree to disagree on that. There is, in fact, something that is hate speech, and I think these groups excel at it. But regardless,
Legally, there is no category called hate speech. I know
Right,
you work
that's
on some law website, but I'm just here to tell you the truth, which is that's a fake category that you're making up.
I didn't say
can't
that
be
it was a legal
arrested.
distinction.
Okay, it's like speech that you hate is hate speech. Okay, fine. But let's just talk about the law here.
okay, well, what the law says is that when speech incites imminent violence, that speech is not protected. And these
Right.
groups, which at their core, in their mission statements, their core is to rid America of anyone who is not white, that presents a different challenge than any other kind of speech. And I think that if the ACLU or other lawyers or anyone else wishes to take its resources and say that these groups are simply not worth their time, I think that's their right to do, and I don't think it shows any change in the law.
I agree with you that it's their right to do that. I agree with you on that. It's their right. They're private institutions. They can do that. But we're moving toward a situation where the left is encouraging Congress to ban certain kinds of political speech.
I think there's a big difference between saying that we're not going to fight for this speech and saying that we want to ban it.
Are you not living in this country? There are people, we have them on the show all the time. Congress needs to step in and ban certain kinds of speech on the internet. That's insane. Like, what about the legacy of free expression in this country? When are you guys, liberals, going to stand up for that? That's the point I'm making. It's not about just the ACLU. It's much bigger than that. Do you not see this?
What I see is that we have to look at all speech on a case-by-case basis. And when that speech shows imminent danger, and that speech is there for the purpose of inciting violence, in many of these cases with these white supremacist groups, if you look at their mission statements, you will see that their underlying mission basically is genocide. So if that's what they're trying to do, it has to be taken in that context. Okay. And if you don't take it in that context...
We're moving very quickly toward banning speech, and I think we're all going to regret it.
I don't think we're looking at banning speech at all. I think we're just choosing what to fight for.
All right. Laura, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Tucker.